I'll do a little review of what you should have picked up from the first chapter before we begin talking about some of the basic macroeconomic measures that we use to describe our economies. Hopefully you understood from chapter 1 that opportunity cost is one of the most important building blocks in economics. Every time we make a choice, we trade off something in order to do something else or in order to get something else. An opportunity cost is the value of the trade-off. It's the value of the next best thing. And we recognize that we have to make those choices because there's only so many things that are possible. We face the concept of scarcity, and we have to recognize that there are limits to the things that are possible for us to do. So we have to make choices. So opportunity cost is the trade-off of our choices, and production possibilities describes the possible outcomes that we could achieve given the resources that we have. So you should have learned about the production possibilities frontier, that it was a graph, it was a model that we use to describe the limits of what is possible. But we also recognize that economic growth is also possible if we obtain more resources or more technology. If those things occur, then the production possibilities frontier will shift outwards, and we can produce more of almost everything. But we have to have economic growth in order to make that happen. So another thing that I'd like to introduce in this week's lesson has to do with a little bit of background as to the language of how we talk about different groups of countries. We generally refer to countries as either being lesser developed, emerging, or developed countries. So lesser developed countries typically have high levels of poverty. They typically don't have good systems of healthcare, education may be limited, oftentimes restricted just to males. Typically very focused on agriculture, not an awful lot of manufacturing or service sector. Lesser developed countries really are just trying to survive. They tend to have low levels of economic development. They tend to be primarily centered in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, as well as parts of Southeast Asia and even into Central Asia. So then we have emerging markets where they're sort of like a developed economy. They typically have rapid economic growth. They typically have an expanding middle class with improved social and political stability. The challenge with emerging markets, however, is while it looks as though they may be rising in the economic ladder, they could just as easily step backward on the economic ladder. It doesn't take much for them to shift backwards also. We typically refer to 4 key countries as being emerging markets. These are the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Brazil, Russia, India, and China typically have the characteristics of emerging markets, and they have for several years, decades even. And these are the emerging markets. You'll notice around the world, there's many markets that are emerging, those are centered primarily in Central South America, as well as Eastern Asia, parts of Eastern Europe might also be considered emerging markets. And then we have developed economies. Developed economies typically are highly developed. They have advanced technology. They tend to be more service sector oriented. They tend to have a great deal of infrastructure, roads, hospitals, electric grids, water supply. And the developed countries of the world primarily are centered in North America, as well as primarily Western Europe. But you'll also notice Japan and South Korea over in Eastern Asia and South Africa at the southern end of the African continent, as well as Australia and New Zealand. They are often referred to as developed economies. So how do we measure our economies? One of the key ways that we will measure our economy is with what's called gross domestic product. So GDP is the value of all the final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Now, the textbook will provide lots of math and discussion on formulas about how this is calculated. And I do not want you to focus on the formulas and the math, but I do just want you to understand what gross domestic product is. It's the value of what we're producing. And every country has a GDP. So for last year, the largest GDPs in the world, you'll notice, was the United States, followed by China, followed by Japan, Germany, India, UK, and then on down the list. The United States has been at the top of the GDP ladder for about 75 years. China has only within the last 20 years emerged to become the second GDP in the world. You'll notice, however, that on the right-hand side of the graph is the GDP figures. So the United States is roughly about $21 trillion during the year 2019. So that's $21 trillion worth of goods and services that we have produced. But you'll notice from the left side of the graph that the United States is not the fastest growing GDP in the world. And even the countries that are listed here are not necessarily the fastest growing countries. There are countries actually in Africa that are growing at double-digit rates. At least they were until February of 2020. But typically the developed world has slower rates of growth in their GDP. The book will describe some of the problems with looking at these numbers. And one of the biggest problems with just looking at the numbers, and especially the size of the numbers, is the reality that those numbers don't tell the whole picture. For example, there are many things that are not included in GDP that we actually are producing. It's just that those numbers are not counted. So for example, household production, things that we just do for ourselves are not actually included in the GDP figure, even though it may be something that we did and we produced, it's just not being counted. So for example, if I mow my own lawn, that does not count for gross domestic product. But if I hire a lawn service to come mow my lawn, that would be counted. So the GDP figure just kind of provides a guide, one of the measures that we'll use to look at the economies of the world. So oftentimes we look at labor. I'll just ask, which country do you suppose has the world's largest labor force? I would imagine most of you probably indicated China, and that is correct. They do have the world's largest labor force, followed by India. It's expected that India will overtake China in the next several decades. But you'll notice that the third largest labor force in the world is the United States. But I like this chart because it shows there is a big difference between numbers 1 and 2 and number 3, and then on down the list. You do not need to memorize the numbers or the names of the country, which is, number 6 or 7 and that sort of thing. But just notice how large those labor force characteristics are. But that doesn't tell us how many of those people are actually working or wanting to work. That would be defined by the labor force participation rate. And even if they want to work, they may not be working. They might be unemployed. So if we look at the unemployment rates of the world, you'll notice there actually are several countries with very low unemployment rates. You'll also notice that many of these countries, Cambodia, Niger, Laos, they're countries that might be considered lesser developed, and getting good statistics is hard to find. So 2017 was the last year that we could get solid unemployment statistics. There's still some doubt about those figures. You will notice, however, that the United States, while we had a low unemployment in 2017, we have a fairly high rate of unemployment right now, as does China and Angola. So these are individuals who would desire to work, but they're without work. So why might they be without work? One reason might be because of cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment is unemployment that is due to the business cycle. Typically, when the economy declines, people lose their jobs simply because businesses will shut down because nobody's walking through the doors. When the economy picks back up again, they will open their doors back up, hopefully, and start hiring more people. So cyclical unemployment goes up and down rather frequently. We also have what's often a very normal type of unemployment, which is called frictional unemployment. This is unemployment that's simply due to the fact that you have job skills, you just have yet to connect with an employer, or you may be looking even for your very first job. You may have quit a job and are looking for another job, but you have skills for what's out there. So for example, if you happen to be a cashier and you lost your job, or you decided you didn't want to work at the company anymore because they were making you work the night shift. So you quit and you decide you are going to look for another cashier's job. You have the skills, so that would be called frictional, and it's perfectly normal. What's often a struggle is structural unemployment. This is unemployment when you lack marketable skills. And this often happens when there's some sort of structural change in an economy. So for example, several decades ago, the United States used to be a country with a very strong textile sector. We used to make a lot of sheets and towels and clothing. We had many individuals who their entire family worked in the textile mills. Well, the textile industry has left the United States. Now, these are individuals who their skills were working sewing machines and working the textile equipment. They might not really have the skills to walk in as a computer programmer. So structural unemployment's pretty severe and usually just takes some retraining in order to get out of structural unemployment. The next measure that we'll talk about is inflation, which is simply an increase in the average price level. Now, the book talks a great deal about how these numbers are calculated, and I'm not looking for you to have an understanding of how these numbers are calculated. But I want you to have an understanding of what inflation does and what it means. It essentially means you're losing the purchasing power on your dollar. Your dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to, or whatever your country's currency is. It doesn't buy as much as it used to buy. So prices on average are rising, and you're now having to pay more for everything. And typically, if inflation is expected, we can make some adjustments ahead of time. But when inflation is unexpected, it catches us off guard. And then we find ourselves in a cycle of having to pay higher wages and higher prices, and yet our wages have not kept up with that. Another problem that we may encounter in a variety of countries is deflation, which is a decrease in the average price level. And again, the book talks mathematically about this, but I don't want you to focus on the math. Just want you to understand the concept. And essentially, with deflation, our prices are falling, and you might think, well, that's a good thing. Except if you're a business owner. If you're a business owner, deflation means you're not earning as much profit as you once did. And you may actually have to start laying people off. And then that cycle even gets worse. Another concept dealing with inflation is the concept of hyperinflation. And this is where the prices are rising so quickly that the whole idea of inflation just doesn't make any sense. So for example, Zimbabwe in 2008, prices were rising at an estimated 80 billion% per year. Prices were rising that quickly. So this picture would show somebody who is taking his currency. He's lost a lot of purchasing power. That's a gentleman who is buying a loaf of bread. That much currency would have been required to purchase a loaf of bread. Currently, the country of Venezuela is experiencing hyperinflation, and the folder for week number 2 has a video that describes why this is occurring. But essentially, there's another image of what hyperinflation does. You've really lost the purchasing power for your currency. So the last thing to talk about is the business cycle. I alluded to it a little bit in talking about unemployment, but generally we recognize there is this up and down motion to an economy. Things seem to get good and then it stops. And at the point where it stops getting good is what we call a peak. And then it seems to get bad. And then that stops at what's called a trough. The time period where your economy is declining is called a recession. And the time period where it's growing is called a recovery. So currently, right now in the United States and pretty much the entire world, we are in a recession. They estimate that the peak was in February of 2020. And then because of the coronavirus, the world has entered into a recession. If the pattern follows like it has for the last several hundred years, we'll eventually stop at a trough and the economy will recover again. It will begin to grow again. So we have this up and down motion in the economy, and it happens this way in every economy of the world. So in general, what we're looking at in Chapter 6 is just a basic understanding of how we measure a country's economy. We look at gross domestic product, the value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. We look at unemployment rates. Obviously, high levels of unemployment are a struggle. Low levels of unemployment you might think are a really good thing, but sometimes low levels of unemployment lead to inflation, which means that the average price levels are rising. And then we also sort of put all of this together and just talking in general terms about the business cycle, that we have this up and down motion. Things are good, things get bad, things get better again. We have peak, recession, trough, and then a recovery again, followed by another peak, and the cycle continues. So hopefully this chapter, what I want you to get out of this chapter is just a basic understanding of these measures.